You're listening to The Big Album Show with Paul Dillon and Dan O'Neill.
Hello and welcome to the latest edition of The Big Album Show. Remember, please, to follow us on Facebook, on Twitter, at The Big Album Show, on Instagram at The Big Album Show. And please, if you like what you hear, please give us a shout out, show us some support, share us with your friends, and we'd really appreciate a review from wherever you get your podcasts from. Dan, it's fair to say that we have reached new levels of support with our Big Album Show podcast.
We really have. We've gotten fantastic encouragement from everyone who's been contacting us on our social media pages. And we have been number one at times in the music commentary podcast charts in Ireland, which is absolutely fantastic. And we're really sharing those charts with some other excellent podcasts that we're big fans of. So it really is an honor to be in that chart with those other podcasts.
Yeah, and to paraphrase Grandad from Only Fools and Horses, I always knew one day we'd get to the top of the charts. But thank you to all our listeners who've made that possible. And thank you to the many listeners who listen to us, not only in Ireland, but in a growing number of countries around the world. Welcome to our listeners in as far away as Australia. I'm not going to sing a song for you, but thank you for listening to us. Australia, Canada. We've got listeners in the US, and we got listeners right over all across the world. And you're really very welcome onto the show. And thank you for listening to us and supporting us here on the Big Album Show. Dan, our last album that we talked about was the Manic Street Preachers' Everything Must Go. And tonight, it's fair to say, we are completely changing tack. Am I right?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a different genre of music altogether. Still, like Everything Must Go, I suppose, it deals with a wide range of themes.
It does indeed, Dan.
But
You better
it is
tell
very
the people
different.
what we're doing, though. You better tell them the album name.
What's Going On by Marvin Gaye.
What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, released on the 20th of May, 1971, Dan. Then, you know, one of the fascinating things about this album, before we get into the meat and drink of it, right, is the amount of Marvin Gaye songs which are in what you might call the popular songbook. I mean, the guy was a Motown legend, the Prince of Motown, they called him. And he really, really was. Prince of Motown, Prince of Soul. So many songs just trip off the tongue, don't they, from Marvin Gaye?
Oh, they do, right throughout his career, whether it was I Heard It Through the Grapevine.
Love it.
And
then I Heard It Through the Grapevine, it's a real upbeat kind of dance disco kind of tune, isn't it? I mean, it's not disco, but it sounds to me like something that you'd hear in a disco.
Yeah, it was definitely like Motown music was music to dance to an awful lot of the time. Like his first single, Pride and Joy, in 1963, was another kind of a upbeat one. But then this album really changed direction for both Marvin Gaye, Motown, and I suppose soul music in general. And then, of course, you mentioned some of Marvin Gaye's kind of songs that have entered the popular songbook in albums after What's Going On. You have classics such as Let's Get It On and Sexual Healing, which I'm sure all our listeners are familiar with because they're just kind of everywhere in popular culture.
They are. And I mean, you know, it's fair to say that when you think about it, Ain't No Mountain High Enough. I Heard It Through the Grapevine. Wherever I Lay My Hat was originally put to record by Marvin Gaye, and of course Sexual Healing and Let's Get It On. Just all absolute classic, lovely, amazing songs that are in the popular songbook. I mean, you have to give out. I mean, awkward as it sounds sometimes to say the name of the song, you have to give a shout out to Sexual Healing. What a beautiful little tune. I mean, that's what you might call a banger from before a banger was even invented. forgive the pun, which was unintended.
Yeah, he so many of his songs are so good, and when he set out to create What's Going On, there really was a shift in his direction.
Yeah,
he was going through a difficult time for a number of reasons. So you had you mentioned Ain't No Mountain High Enough. Of course, the other singer on that song was Tammy Terrell, who sadly got very, very ill, had a brain tumor.
And that had a terrible effect on him, didn't it, Dan?
It really did, and coupled with that tragedy and awful circumstances, like I think Tammy Terrell herself deserves a very honourable mention because the
Definitely.
songs that she is on, they're just brilliant. And coupled with that tragedy, he had a marriage breakup. He had a cocaine addiction, and the album before What's Going On, he decided he wasn't going to be involved in the promotion of the album, and
Mm.
he basically stayed at home, refusing to be involved in the promotion. And that's when he kind of lost his clean cut image. He grew a beard, and he became the Marvin Gaye of What's Going On.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things, Dan, I mean, as you go through it, you have to conclude as well that music was changing because I mean Motown was a singles affair, um, and you know the people at the top of Motown Records, that's what they believed and that's what they wanted to do, and they really didn't want this kind of direction for Marvin Gaye whatsoever. And they were dead against him doing it, and they were dead against the idea of this, you know, concept album that he wanted to put out. But I think it's fair to say that, you know, that long form that Marvin developed, very, very influential on the form of music. And I mean, because you're entering into this period of the 70s, where Marvin Gaye, he really did change music, didn't he? And what you hear on this record, and it's a remarkable record, and if you people aren't familiar with it, just go and get it. You will not regret it. But what's remarkable, what you hear is you hear Motown, you hear soul, you hear blues, you hear jazz. Sometimes you hear all four going on in the one tune, and it is a remarkable collaborative record, isn't it, Dan?
Yeah, and I
Um,
think you almost hear kind of proto hip hop, you know, that kind of with the bongos. Obviously, Marvin Gaye has been sampled hundreds, if not thousands, of times by hip hop artists. But I
yeah,
think you're seeing the foundations of modern music being created here. And you said you know, listen to it live, or you listen to it live. I think he only performed it all the way through once live,
that's
but
true. Yeah,
what an absolute performance. Um, and as you mentioned, the Motown bosses, they really didn't like the idea of Marvin Gaye kind of indulging in this kind of what they saw as very kind of a political message. They hated it, but once he had the success of the first track that was released as a single, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, and once that was a success, Barry Gordy, who was the boss in Motown Records, approached Marvin Gaye asking him for an album. And knowing that Marvin Gaye liked a bit of a bet, he bet him that he couldn't produce the album What's Going On in 30 days. And Marvin Gaye delivered. So not only is this an incredible album, it's an incredible album recorded in 30 days, you know?
yeah, and I mean, all the more remarkable for it. And I think, I mean, one of the things I find about this album is that it frankly, it makes me want to lie down and relax.
Yeah.
But the themes that it deals with are far from easy ones. I mean, in many ways, would you call this a protest album? You'd have to say there's protest songs on it. There's elements of protest right throughout, isn't there?
There is loads of political themes, but the guy who wrote the song "What's Going On," a guy called Obie Benson, who was in it. Well, actually, it wasn't Obie Benson who wrote it, but Obie Benson had the came up with the idea for the song, and a guy called Al Cleveland then wrote it based on conversations with Benson. And Benson said, he said, you know, it's not a protest song. All I'm doing is asking what's going on. You know,
Yeah.
I'm naming the problems that exist. But he didn't want to frame it as a protest song. But I think, you know, when you listen to look back at what Marvin Gaye said in terms of his experience and his experience of witnessing riots and his own brother fighting in Vietnam, etc.
Yeah.
I think it's clear that there is a protest message in this album.
Yeah, definitely, and you know, it comes from a political context, doesn't it? I mean, what wasn't it Ronaldo Benson, the you know who wrote the song? He'd been caught up on it, hadn't he, in the Bloody Thursday incident, and he'd been on a bus, and you know, as part of the Four Tops that got stuck in the protests around that time, and that was the famous 1969 anti-war rally. and you had Ronald Reagan was in the background. He was the governor of California at the time, and he'd ordered a clampdown, hadn't he, on the University of California, Berkeley, and he called it a haven of communist sympathizers, protesters, and sex deviants. And there was a big anti-war rally, and Reagan ordered the police and the National Guard to go in, and there was riots, and bayonets and shotguns, many injuries. One person died, and that was Bloody Thursday. And he witnessed that on the bus. And as you say, he asked that question, "What's happening?" And yeah, from that came "What's Going On?" And of course, Marvin Gaye added his own twist to that. He added in some lyrics, particularly focused on his brother and his brother's experience in Vietnam. And what you get is an extraordinary piece of music, which must be, I mean, it is his signature tune. I think, certainly for me, very very different to maybe a lot of the hits that people are also familiar with. Um, but isn't it an incredibly intense, atmospheric listening, while also being quite relaxing and gentle and easy. There's quite a lot going on in one song, isn't there, Dan?
There is, and on Motown records previous to What's Going On, right? They often had the slogan on the various single covers and album covers: Motown, the sound of young America.
Yeah,
And this album was when the naivety left music, when the sound of young America ended, and it became a much more in-depth look at the real themes affecting America. And even if you look at the album cover, incredible cover, by the way. Marvin Gaye just looks brilliant. You have the rain falling, but on the back you have Marvin Gaye standing in the rain, surrounded by abandoned toys, kind of
yeah.
hinting at the idea that things are changing. We're not as innocent as we used to be, and now we're willing to get stuck into these difficult themes. But as you say, the incredible music, and the experience all the musicians who play on the record bring to the table makes it quite it's just it is so relaxing. It's one of those albums that I love to kind of lie down with my headphones on and listen to. And one of the reasons I love listening to it, particularly with headphones, is because it really brings out the sound of the various musicians. One of them being, now he didn't play on all the tracks, but he plays on most of the tracks. The bass player James Jamerson, he he has to be one of the greatest bass players ever. Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and when asked about in an interview about what he would recommend young bass players to do when learning how to play the bass, he said you should sit down and you should learn how to play along with What's Going On by Marvin Gaye. Even though obviously the Red Hot Chili Peppers are from a completely different genre, it
Yeah.
just shows the high esteem that James Jamerson is held in. And apparently, when he first sat down to record the album with Marvin Gaye, he was so drunk that he couldn't sit on a chair, and he actually, so the story goes, he lay on the ground playing the bass for the song "What's Going On," but it sounds amazing, you know.
It does, Dan. And I mean, listeners to the Big Album Show will know that we do a top three. It gets my number one. I'm going to assume it gets your number one as well. Am I right?
Yeah, I'd say it's definitely it's definitely one of my number ones anyway. It's yeah, it's a really good song, and what a way to start an album. And even you can hear kind of Marvin Gaye's double tracked vocals on it. So sometimes it sounds like Marvin Gaye is actually singing with himself and harmonizing with himself. And apparently that was a mistake initially. So he asked the producer to record his voice on two separate tracks so he could listen to which one was the best. But the producer pressed play on both of the tracks at the same time by mistake. And so you had this effect. And when Marvin Gaye heard it, he thought it was so good that he began to use it pretty much for the rest of his career. And I think it really adds a kind of a live fluidity to the album.
I mean, it became his signature move, really, didn't it, Dan?
It
And
did.
it happened by accident. So, giving tribute again to the words of John Lennon. life is what happen. Life is what happens when you're busy making other plans. And it's remarkable. There's some remarkable songs on the album. It's very difficult to come up with a little list. For me, Inner City Blues, Make Me Wanna Holler,
Yeah.
is the second finest track on it. It is dark. It is relaxing to listen to,
Yeah.
and you can sit back and just take it easy. But when you listen to the lyrics, things get pretty serious. He kind of paints the picture of the man on the moon in the background, but then people not having much on the ground. He says rockets, moonshots, spending on the have-nots, money we make it, before we see it, you take it. Oh, make you want to holler the way they do my life. I mean, that is a. I mean, we discussed this, whether this is a protest song or a protest album or not. I mean, for me, that's very very strong elements of a protest song, and what you get going through that is you get that voice, that incredibly sweet soulful voice that he has, which is remarkable in that it's so instantly recognizable as him. Nobody else sings like him.
Yeah, and this song is incredibly authentic because you have both Marvin Gaye bringing his own experience to the table, but the person Marvin Gaye wrote this song with was a guy called James Nix Jr. And Marvin Gaye had this tendency to work with songwriters and musicians from Motown sometimes that others didn't regard as well as they should. And James Nick Jr., he was a working class man. He had 8 kids. He was, as well as being a songwriter for Motown, he was also the janitor and the elevator operator. Um, so it's not as if when they were writing the song, they're singing from the perspective of superstars. Even though obviously they were stars, but they're earthed. They're singing from their own experience, and I think you can hear that very clearly.
Yeah, I think so, Dan. And there's a remarkable live performance of it. You mentioned earlier he hadn't played in the 4 years prior. He did a big gig May 1st, 1972, in Washington D.C. The city declared May 1st Marvin Gaye Day, and he did this remarkable show. And 4 years since he played any shows at all. And the recording of it, they do that. You can get the live album, and on the recording he does it twice. And it is a very 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 fine song indeed. Dan, do you have a number three, or dare I ask?
Yeah, well, I'd say you picked this as your number three as well. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that. Did you pick "Mercy, Mercy Me," the Ecology, as your number three?
No.
No, you didn't. Oh my God, we have a difference of opinion here. Well, let's talk about "Mercy, Mercy Me" first, and we'll leave the listeners in suspense for a few minutes, and we'll find out what you picked. "Mercy, Mercy Me." For when I listen to it, what I hear one of the first songs, pop songs, if you want to call it that, or soul song, that deals with the issue of environmentalism. Like, he is singing about environmental destruction 50 years ago in a way that still sounds as fresh and as relevant as ever, right here, right now. Um, it's a brilliant song. Um, the I think it's catchy. I think it's soulful. I think, as you say, it's relaxing, but it still has a kind of it has an anger to it, because Marvin Gaye is turning around and he's saying, "Look at the environmental destruction around me. Look at the toxic wind. Look at what's happening to this beautiful earth of ours." And I think that message clearly is now more relevant than ever. And if
Yeah,
any song I've ever heard has managed to stand the test in time
that's right.
and stay sounding contemporary, it's "Mercy, Mercy Me." It could be written and sung today, and you wouldn't bat an eyelid.
Dan, that little that take really has inspired me now. I feel as if I'm going to go on Twitter straight away and start rounding up support for stricter action on climate change, and I'm going to go do more recycling and I'm gonna, really cut down on my footprint. I mean, but I mean, in all seriousness, you're right. And I think, I mean, for me, my probably to complete my top
Mm,
three would probably God is Love,
mm,
because it is a classic slice of gospel, right? Bang in the at the heart of the album. Um, and Marvin Gaye, when you listen to him talk, he's a beautiful speaking voice, and he talks about, he often talks about, he's so articulate. But one of the things he says in God is Love, he kicks off by going, "Oh, don't go and talk about my father. Talk about my father. God is my friend." And he had a very troubled and difficult relationship with his father, well documented, and that his father was very abusive when he was young. And when I heard that, you can hear the pain in his voice, I think,
mm,
even though it's a very uplifting song, and you can't help but think that he's talking about his father a little bit. I would like to say, Dan, as well, while we're talking about, I mean, I think it is really important when we're talking about this album that we remember Marvin Gaye. He died far, far too young in very tragic circumstances in 1984. But I just wanted to read out a couple of his words. If people aren't familiar with Marvin Gaye, this is from around the time of that concert that I mentioned in Washington, D.C. in 1972. That was when they gave him the um, uh, Marvin Gaye Day, as it was called. And you can get the live album, and it's really, really well worth a listen, just called Marvin Gaye What's Going On Live, which is a recording of that concert. But it's very interesting. His attitude was very, very interesting, because he said, he didn't want to do the show, and he explained, he said, "I'm still mad at Washington. What had they given me? Why should they all of a sudden love me now that I've sold a few records? Where were they when I needed them? I considered Detroit, not Washington, my home. I resented the whole thing. I just turned 33. That was the age that Jesus died. I had a strong fear that I'd never live longer than Jesus. Um, and I wasn't interested in exposing myself any more than necessary." Marvin Gaye was a fantastic artist, an amazing singer, brilliant recording artist, beautiful singing voice, led a very interesting life, but led a extremely hard, difficult, and ultimately tragic life, didn't he, Dan?
he did. And one of the things that kind of makes me sad looking at this album 50 years later is that a lot of the kind of pain and social problems and environmental problems, and discrimination that's referenced in the songs still exist
Yeah,
to a great deal today. And maybe it's a sad thing in many ways that some of the songs, in terms of their lyrics, resonate so much today and sound so contemporary, because that's not to say that, over the last 50 years, activists and human rights activists in the United States haven't, fought and made one great concessions over time. And it's not to take away from that, but obviously, the fight goes on. And when you listen to the pain on the album, and the struggles Marvin Gaye is singing about, you can see some comparisons today. But Marvin Gaye also, he kind of there's this kind of, when you listen to the album and you listen to it closely, you can almost feel a sense, and this might sound a bit daft, right? But from start to finish, even though there's pain, there's anger, there's protest, there's a sense of love. There's a sense of a kind of a plea to people to come together. And he seems to see the beauty in the world,
yeah.
even at times of great pain and injustice. And I think that's profound. I think it's prophetic.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Dan. I mean, and you've said it better than I ever could. I mean, when you think about trying to sum up an album like this, it sounds relaxing, but then its themes are very deep. All human life is there, because there is a kind of, at times, there's this little optimism. There's beauty, there's joy, there's certainly love, but there is some amount of pain to put on one record.
Hmm. Yeah, it is. And like, they were difficult times for people. They
Yeah,
really
and I
were.
think there's a bravery and an honesty in how he approached that record. And I mean, the story of it alone, becoming this Motown huge. I mean, he was the biggest. Remember, he was the biggest Motown star of the '60s, right? I
Mm.
mean, he was number one, and he was the Prince of Motown. And then he tilts in the early '70s and does this album, which his record label are completely opposed to. Didn't want him putting out. He had to put out the single in secret behind the boss, but the back of the senior record executives, and then he records this album in 30 days. And so many people reference this as one of their favorite albums, and it's very, very interesting. Not all sorts of people just really, really love this album, and it has influenced. It's fair to say, Dan. I mean, you'd have to put it up there as. I mean, there we go and say Hot Take is one of the most influential albums of all time. I'm not sure how far you could go with that one, but it certainly has influenced. It's been a huge influence on contemporary music, hasn't it?
Yeah, like a number of music publications like Rolling Stone, NME, at various stages, they've named What's Going On as the number one most influential album ever. And I think you hit the nail on the head there, Paul. This album is an album appreciated by people from all walks of life. Like a lot of people, they might be rock fans or Britpop fans or folk fans or whatever they are, right? And they might not necessarily be into Motown or soul. But when you mention this album to them, most people kind of light up and have an experience with it. It's it's one of those pieces of work that crosses genres and is just objectively brilliant.
It is. I completely agree, and it's a challenge actually to try and put it into words.
Mm.
In many ways, because listening and it's an album not to be experienced track by track. It's an album to be experienced fully from start, beginning, middle, and end. It's that kind of record, isn't it? And I would really encourage people as well, if you like the album, check out the live version, Marvin Gaye, What's Going On Live. Now, and one of the things that's interesting is when you think about it, he recorded this album at a time of great change in music. The single, which had been King, was in Motown. He rejected that and embraced the album long form way of doing things. And music keeps on changing, it keeps evolving. And I mean, the idea now of a live album, I think it's fair to say the live album has fallen out of favor. But here in the Big Album Show, we're keen to bring it back. And it definitely is. It is one of the best live albums you're ever going to hear. And not every track is flawless or perfect, but when you listen to it, they managed to record some of the intensity and joy and love of that occasion in Washington DC in '72. So look, for me, Dan, I'm going to give this album a very, very healthy and very, very positive 8 out of 10. And I'm, definitely going to keep coming back to it. It's a joy to listen to, and I would strongly recommend. How about you?
Yeah, I'm going to give it a 9.5 out of 10 because I really do believe it lives up to its name as one of the greatest albums in music history. And I think I think what you're saying about this kind of being a move away from the Motown single format towards the more meaningful album format is really interesting because right now in music, I think to some extent because of music streaming and that sort of thing, we're moving much more towards the kind of model of people listening to individual songs and singles online. Now that's not to say there hasn't been fantastic albums released in the last number of years. Even this year, there's been great albums released. But I think this album shows it's a great example of how the album as a format is incredibly, incredibly important because you just couldn't possibly reflect, as you said, kind of all of human life in one song. Whereas this album, as a piece of work, when it just manages to capture so much of the feeling, the energy um, of 1971 in the United States, warts and all. And I think it just shows what an important format the album is.
Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more with you, Dan. And so say all of us, and I think all of our listeners on the Big Album Show. If you're interested, please do get in touch with us. Many people do. It's lovely to hear from people. Thank you for your takes, and thanks again for your support for the show. And please continue to back us. We really appreciate it. And thanks for listening to this edition of the Big Album Show.
You're listening to the Big Album Show with Paul Dillon and Dan O'Neill.